So, for those of you who, many of you have been here before, but my name is Alex Konieczny. I'm a recent graduate from Oakland University with a bachelor's degree in anthropology and a specialization in archaeology. So I'm going to be doing our talk here about kind of Archaeology 101, what is it, how do we do it, things of that nature. And since we actually had a little bit of archaeology going on here at the village, I'm going to talk a little bit about that too. Should be pretty cool. All right, so first question is, what is archaeology? Does anybody have any ideas, just kind of before we get going, of kind of what you think it is?
Digging in the dirt and not looking for plants or worms, but looking for leftover pieces of china or utensils.
That's a good kind of a layman description. That works pretty well. Any other contributions or? Nobody brave enough? Okay. Well, archaeology is a subfield of anthropology. And anthropology is studying people. It's basically exactly what it means, studying people. So there are actually 4 main fields of anthropology. Some people might tell you there's more, but 4 is pretty much the working number. There's cultural anthropology, which is you go and live with the native peoples of wherever and learn all about them and record the customs and behaviors and things like that. It's studying literally culture, appropriately enough, right? There's the physical or biological archaeology, which if anyone ever watches the show Bones or anything like that, they say she's a forensic anthropologist, but that really what she is a physical anthropologist. She's studying the physical human body, how it evolves, how it changes, and things like that. So if you ever hear of Lucy, one of the early humanoids they discovered in Africa, or Australopithecus, or any of these others, that's what those people are studying. That's physical or biological anthropology. Linguistic is, of course, studying language. And then there's that last one, archaeology, which is studying human past, the material remains that we've left behind. So china and bits of bones and things like that, as Joanne pointed out for us. But it doesn't necessarily mean just digging in the dirt. You can also, of course, look through records and things like that. And that's going to be one of the things we talk about, why we'll do that instead of digging more often than not. And for those of you who may not have noticed, it is not digging for dinosaurs. That's paleontology. None of that. Okay. Yeah, it's paleontology will cover a lot of the same things, but it has this nice little space cut right out of it, which is morphologically modern humans, which is us. So why do we do it? Well, 2 big reasons, although there's a third one which is fun, but I don't think that counts under the, the official description. First one is preservation, because more often than not, when they're going to go put in a new bypass or a new big building somewhere, a lot of times those construction companies will hire a team of archaeologists, and there's archaeological firms that go and do this, and they'll hire these people to go through and look ahead, excavate, plan ahead, and see if that new bypass happens to be going through a Native American burial ground or something like that. More often, actually in London, they're constantly bumping into Copper and Bronze Age settlements right in the middle of downtown London, and they have to stop their construction. Things get held up for years. So a lot of times we'll go through ahead of time and check for that. And actually right now in Turkey, they're putting in a lot of dams along one of the main rivers that runs through Turkey. And there's a lot of settlements that were built along that river over thousands of years. And so archaeologists are going through and checking those places out and trying to save as much as we can before it all just backs up and floods and all of that is destroyed and lost. And the other reason is education, so that we can walk away learning something from this, understand better who we are as a people, what our history is, things of that nature. Why don't we do excavation, I should say? Archaeology can be study things that are already dug out of the dirt, but why don't we do excavation? Because archaeology is, by definition, destruction. When you excavate a site, you will never, ever, 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 ever get it back the same way it was. Anyone who's bought something at Target and it comes in that nice little box and it's all packed together and you're like, oh, this is no problem. You pull it out, you'll never get it back into that box. Same kind of thing. It'll never be the same. Once you've excavated a site, you have destroyed all of that data. And all you can hope is that you've taken sufficiently good notes that you could almost put it back together if you really, really tried. So before we do any excavation, we want to make sure we have a really good research question. So this is, kind of the scientific method here. You have the question, your hypothesis, that kind of thing. You want to start with a question. Why are we going to excavate this site in the first place? What do I want to learn from excavating? Because if you just go, look, there's a neat thing, I'm going to go dig up this space. You'll walk away going, we found lots of things, but we didn't study anything. We didn't learn anything specific from it. And if your focus is too broad, you're not going to get any in-depth information necessarily. And we have to think about whether or not there is a benefit to actually excavating. Is there another way that you can answer that question? So if you go, I want to know about barns. I want to study the barn that was here. This looks interesting. You can most likely study a lot of the things there is to know about that space without excavating at all. You can do small-scale excavations. You can just do research. You can look at other people's excavations of barns. You don't always need to go and tear up the dirt. So another reason, of course, preservation. Didn't I just say that was one of the reasons we do it? Yeah. Well, it's also one of the reasons we don't. Because once again, you've destroyed that site. If anybody else comes by later with a question, they may not be able to answer it because now all of what their focus would have been has been lost. Because archaeology is, by definition, destruction. So a little bit now about the methodology, which is how we go about doing something or why we go about doing it. Step one, I wish my office looked like this. Yeah, lots and lots and lots of research. And you want to know as much as you can possibly before you ever put a single shovel in the dirt. This is the most important step because you need to understand your site and the time period before you even start. So for example, does anybody know what this is? It's not something that really gets used too much anymore, maybe in more of an agricultural community or a farming community. No ideas. Pardon?
Not a bird bath?
It's a little smaller than a bird bath.
A very light dumbbell.
See, that was, I almost told you guys it wasn't that just right off the bat. This is a hog scraper. It's for removing the bristles after you've butchered a hog. If you found that in the dirt, we all would have gone, oh, I don't know what that is. Having known ahead of time, though, that lets us go, okay, I found a hog scraper. We know that this place was, or at least we can infer, that this space was used for butchering hogs. Another guess, who's got it? I know, this one's even better, right? Nope. Help you guys out a little bit? It's not for hair. No, you see the ruffled collar here? It's for ironing those little ruffles. Those will fit over the end of this here, and you can iron it out and keep them nice and crisp and fresh, right? You never would have known, right? And my personal favorite, yep, a rock or a potato. It's a rock, right? And it's kind of hard to tell because, with just the resolution here. But this end is kind of chipped up a little bit. So this is not just a rock, though.
Milling stone or something like that.
Similar to, yeah. This is what's called a hammerstone. And when you're doing flint knapping or making stone tools, things like arrowheads, hand axes, that kind of thing, you would use this to strike against the flint and knock off chunks. And that's what this does. So this would have been something used by, I won't say Native Americans because everybody's used these the world over, but Native peoples would have used these things to make stone tools. So again, I could infer about this site if I found this digging somewhere that this might have been used for stone tool production. And that'll tell us a lot about the site that we may have missed had we not done our research and really understood what was going on before we started digging. So step 2. Archaeology happens in phases. So there's phases within steps. It gets very confusing. Phase 1 and 2 are technically separate, but usually are used together. It's mapping, survey, research, mapping of the site, and then test pits or shovel pits. Now, these guys right now are doing a site survey, which means you line up just as they are, 3 feet apart, 4 feet apart, depending on the search area and how many people you have. And you just walk. They've got probably 3 or 4 people along in here with compasses to keep them facing the right direction. And you go, oop, there's something, I think in this one they're sticking those little pink flags in where they find things. And you mark these things, and you record where they are, so that later you can look at your map and go, oh, yeah, look, there's a whole bunch of stuff right in this area. That might tell us something. Maybe we should excavate there. And I love this picture because they're doing something similar, but one, they're being really smart about it, and two, they're doing what's called shovel pits, or test pits. So you can see she's excavating just a small space. She's using a big old shovel. This is not the finite work. This is there anything down there? Nope. Is there anything down there? Nope. Clink, clink. Okay. Artifact, mark it, bag it, that kind of thing. So they're going to work their way across the field. You can see a couple of spaces here and there where they've already dug other shovel pits. And they're going to work their way all the way across this field and try to find if there's any artifacts within that field. Then they map them, and when you have a good density in one place, you might think that that'd be a good spot to excavate. So that's what they're doing. This is just preliminary. Maybe there's something down there. Let's find out. And for those of you who came to last month's lecture, you may remember in Israel, there was a number of universities that took part in a survey that did almost the entire country. They did hundreds of miles of space and found many, many, many sites that way. So this can be done on a large scale or a quite small scale. So this is from an excavation in Cambodia of an Iron Age site, and I gotta say I love this picture, so we're gonna spend a little bit of time on it. This is like the perfect snapshot of just, a moment in time on a site. You've got the guy up here who's just like, I'm bored, I've been up since 4 in the morning. Although he's not wearing shoes, and I like this is a good thing on his part, because up here, until kind of looking at it, this is fairly sandy and soft soil. If you're wearing heavy shoes and that kind of thing, you can tear up the ground, and that's going to interfere with your study. So he's got this guy doing that thing there. You've got, let's see, she's down here recording, she's got a couple of carpentry rulers, and she's trying to map out this collection of pottery that's right here. And you notice it's been left in place. So when you're excavating and you're very carefully slicing away the layers, you're not just going to yank everything up as soon as you see it, because you want to see how everything fits together. So my favorite explanation of this is it's called context, and it's one of the major things, and we're going to talk about it. But I've got a chair right here in front of me. So now you guys are all facing more or less this chair. So if there was none of you sitting here, though, and we're just looking at this like a site, you go, a bunch of chairs are all facing this chair. Something interesting is happening in this chair, right? And since none of you have fallen asleep yet, our hypothesis is looking pretty good. What about that chair back there, though? If I move this chair and it's back over there, well, now it's kind of tucked off to the side. Nothing important necessarily happening with that chair. It's not in front of everyone. It's just kind of tucked, right? So now it's a less significant thing. If I took this same chair and dragged it over into the doorway and propped open the door with it, now what is it? It's a chair, but it's also a doorstop, right? So where you find things and how they're connected to everything else is what really helps us to understand a site and really understand what's going on there. It's not just the items, because the items themselves, you guys know we have chairs, right? Chairs are not interesting in and of themselves usually, but because that one is in somewhere unique, then it becomes interesting. So she's going to leave things in situ, and we can get to a little bit more in depth with that in a minute. But and it kind of got cut off here at the bottom, but this guy's carefully dusting away with a brush, which is the image everyone has of the archaeologist in the field, right? Carefully brushing away, little picks and tools. You don't usually do that, but it looks good. I've used pickaxes and backhoes on excavations before, so it's kind of a spectrum. You really do have a lot going on here. This tool, this right here is it's a big kind of a telescoping ruler type thing, and that's used with a surveyor's transit. Those things you always see guys on the side of the road looking through them and taking measurements. That's going to help them measure depths. So that's going to be held straight up, and then somewhere off camera here, they've got a transit, and it's going to help them record what depths they're at. And then they can use that information to add to their own notes. Okay, we found this at this depth. We found this at this depth. Things like that. So I could spend forever on this. This has got really a lot going on. So this is the data collection. Excavation, that's what this phase is. Phase 3 is excavation and data collection. It's incredibly expensive and time-consuming. You've all seen the Niles Barnard house over here on the corner. When we moved that here, there has been some excavations done on those grounds. And I was speaking with Dr. Stamps, who was our first speaker here, and he says, we were going to go back and excavate one more season. We thought, well, let's get paid for it. Let's do this right. They got up to about $29,000 and decided it really wasn't worth excavating. And that's just a small, little historic home in Troy, Michigan. This is, hardly a, large-scale excavation in Egypt or anything like that, because you want to pay as many people as you can. You've got to get food, travel, tools, all of those things. It becomes very expensive and very time-consuming. Again, the last two speakers we've had, the sites they were discussing, they spent years, because you only get, let's see, from maybe May to October in Michigan is pretty much your sweet spot. Anything too much the other way, and it's damp or cold or just cold, and you can't really excavate. Some places it's longer, some places it's really, really short. So your seasons, you may not be able to dig for more than a month or two at a time. So you have to come back year after year after year after year. There's some excavations, like on Fort Michilimackinac, is still going on after some 50 plus years now, is my understanding. It's a really, really long running site. They have a nice big grant that takes care of all that, though. And at this point, note-taking is your best friend, and it's the most important thing you can do, because it's not your trowel that's the most important thing. It's your piece of paper and your pencil, because you're recording everything that's going on right there. Where you found things, what depths, where you started that day, where you ended that day. Because I can tell you from experience, you come back the next day and you're looking at your finds and going, let's see, I found this, and I found this, and where did this come from? You check your notes and you go, oh, that's right, I had that nice little pocket of whatever was going on there. Note-taking is crucial, because remember, once you've excavated, it's done. You'll never be able to look at that site the same way again. It's kind of it's just one and done kind of a thing there. So you take those just impeccable notes, and hopefully you could almost put it back the way it was. Almost. So like I said, context is the biggest thing. And what that means is it's an item's location and everything else around it. So the chair is here, the pews are here, the walls, these little walls here, everything's location around everything else. And cannot be understated how important that is, and however, can be underlined. So we're going to do a little activity again here. So this is our square, a little 3 feet by 3 feet, we'll say. And we'll say this is North America, just make it easy on you guys. We'll say we find an arrowhead. What could we say about this now that we found this arrowhead? What does this tell us now? Yep, Native Americans. That's certainly a possibility, although we'll get to, when we talk about what we found here, we'll talk a little bit about. Well, yeah, there's the thing. So people have been in the United States area here, North America, for 15,000 plus years. Some people say 20, some people say even further back than that. And a lot of that comes into just educated guessing. They wouldn't call it educated guessing, but that's what it is. So this could be from any time period, and it's pretty well done, so it might be a little more modern. So we'll say it's a relatively modern arrowhead. Probably Native Americans here. Okay. We got musket balls now. Now what's going on here? Could be. Could be an encampment. Could be. That was from a French trapper trader, and this was someone he was buying beaver skins from. Totally peaceful encounter. All right, now you got a copper kettle. Now what's going on? Cooking, or trading maybe? Could be trading, could just be an outpost. You got trade beads. Trade's starting to look pretty good, right? Yep. All right, well, let's take those two away. Let's put instead, that's a button from a U.S. military uniform, mid-1800s. Someone else could probably tell you better than I can. Now what's going on?
A fort.
Could be a fort. Oh, got a bayonet going now, too. Could have been a battle. War is starting to look like an option now. Let's add the kettle and the trade beads back in. Could have been a fight over resources. I would go with, personally, that this could have been a trading outpost, perhaps a military fort, something like that. So you've got domestic life, you've got military, you've got trade, a little bit of everything, right? So And we just saw the same handful of artifacts rearranged a few times, and it totally changes how you would interpret a space. So I did mention briefly what we talked about in situ, which means you're going to leave things as you're excavating where they are. And I can tell you when there's something sticking out of the sidewall of one of your excavation pits, it's incredibly frustrating not just pulling it out and bagging it and looking at it. It's like, it's right, no, gotta leave it. Because that means you're gonna look at this later and you're gonna photograph it and you're gonna be able to see how everything's connected to everything else in there. It's kind of like the difference between looking at your day calendar and looking at your month calendar, right? So this is just a couple of pictures here of things that were left in situ. And if I just told somebody, all right, there's some animal bones that looks like part of a goblet or glass of some sort, probably some clamshells and stuff in there, you could say that's a kitchen. Just those pieces. All together though, all in a big jumble like this, all left in place like this? Exactly right. We call them a Midden Pile, which is fancy for a trash pit. And that's exactly what it is. You know what? I wanted to say this was somewhere out on the East Coast. What do they call it? Monticello, something, one of those places perhaps. I wanted to say. I might be wrong. I was not personally here. This is just Brother Google helped me out. I also was not in Cambodia either for reference here. So step 4, analysis and publication. So you're going to look through everything that you just looked, everything you've collected, everything you've written down, and you're going to spend a long time going through it and understanding as much as you possibly can. And again, last month we discovered it takes about 1 season, could be up to 4 years of research, if not more, depending on the site you're working. If it's somewhere small with less finds, maybe a little bit less. If you're in a particularly artifact-rich site like the Niles House, you could have 5, 6, 7, 8 years just for 1 season of excavation. And that's going through all of the artifacts, that's identifying ceramic maker's marks and understanding everything that was going on there. It could take years and years and years and years. And then publish. It's amazing how many groups will spend years excavating and unknown thousands of dollars going into this and all the time and all the money and all of this spent. And they know what happened there, but they don't publish their results. Nobody else knows, which you're cheating everyone else out of the one of 2 reasons we do this in the first place, which is education. So there are plenty of sites I know of a handful in Israel in particular that had some 10, 15 years worth of excavating and no published results yet. And this was 30, 40 years ago that this was going on. And part of that is because it takes years and years and years to analyze it, and most of the time by then your money starts running out. So one of the things that really makes archaeology work and how we most often date things is called the law of superposition. And we borrowed this from geology and geography. But really what it means is the oldest things are on the bottom and the youngest things are on the top. So you got the Coke bottle on top, you got the musket down in the middle, and you got the arrowhead down there on the bottom. Of course, there's also the law of association, which means if that Coke bottle was down here with the musket, well, it was probably a Civil War reenactors thing going on, is probably my guess. But you would infer then, okay, these are separate. There's soil in between them, there's separate layers in between them, they're not related items. But if that Coke bottle was down here, in the same layer as the musket, the law of association says most likely those things are connected in some way. And it may cause us to change our thinking a little bit. In the case of being a Civil War reenactment, that's buried that far down is a little odd, but there you have it. And the other thing is stratigraphy. And you saw a little bit of stratigraphy in the last slide, but what that is that's the layers of soil. And just as you can see there's different widths here. So I know a lot of times people ask, well, yeah, like how old something is, but how far down it is, right? And I think and technically, yes, but more specifically, it's not how far down it is. It's not like, oh yeah, that was 2 feet down, so I know that this is, 50 years old. There isn't an interchange like that. Because you got, this one's quite thick, this is a little thinner, that's thin, that's real thin compared to this layer. So layers don't always add up evenly, so you couldn't just say, yeah, that far down is roughly this age. It doesn't quite work that way. But as things layer up, and this is what the side of your, if you're excavating a square, if you're standing down on the bottom of it and looking at the side, this is what it would look like. This is a particularly nice one. It doesn't usually look this colorful. But I tried to find nice, really vivid ones. Most of the time you sit there and go, that could be a different layer right there. But let's say, so down here you had maybe some sort of an occupation. Maybe there's a little village here. So all their stuff was down there. And then maybe there's a big flood and it deposited a bunch of silt and some other stuff happened here. Nothing was occupied for years. We can read stratigraphy like that, and it gives you kind of a little slice of how that space has changed over time. So you can see right here, somebody messed with it. That was someone literally just dug a hole right down into the ground, and that'll show up in your stratigraphy. So you have to look at that too. It's not just, well, there's nice, neat layers here, that's all fine. That's an incursion, is what we call that, as an incursion. So now you can't just assume that because this and this are in the same, on the same layer, that they're related though, because this came from way up high. So this could have been, let's say, 300 years ago, and this was 100 years ago. That doesn't make this space down here 300 years old, right? No. That makes it 100 years old, because it was connected to everything up here. And that over there is probably a little charcoal pit, would be my guess. And this is a particularly nice one too, just because it's got those really nice crisp little thin lines. And you can see where people started occupying this, because this all looks like very natural sediment to me. Nothing really changes too dramatically. It's all nicely blended, and then you get these nice crisp lines that run across now. And that means people are doing something to it, most likely. Or you've got regular river floods or something. But now the fun part. We did archaeology here. Sort of impromptu, a little bit. You all came walking up these really nice new pathways that we just put in last fall. And before we did that, we had to kind of regrade the village just a little bit. So we dug a nice big trench that ran from, if you walked out of the general store, went about halfway across the green, starts there and goes almost all the way up to the main city hall up here. Nice long trench, about 2-3 feet wide, about 3.5 feet deep. And they were going to just put a big old pipe down there. What we found was there's actually a wall, right? It's actually pretty much right underneath the walkways right now, unfortunately. There was a fieldstone and lime mortar wall, which fits pretty nicely with mid-1800s Troy. That's about what we'd expect to see here. But it's not something that's really been well explained yet. There's been a couple of theories around about, well, maybe it was a well house is what I've heard. There's supposed to be a well house on this site. It's a pretty thick wall. It's not, if you're thinking just a well house foundation, it wouldn't be very thick. It's just a little shack basically that'll go over a well just to keep all the bugs and stuff off. So that looked pretty heavy duty to me, so I'm thinking probably more likely a barn based on what I've seen with this. But you got these nice big clean, big fieldstones. You can see all these little white chunks and dust all over it. That's from the lime mortar that would have held those together. We also found, much to my excitement, an arrowhead. And it was, and I say much to my excitement because at the time I was very excited. But it turns out of everything else we found, which was a number of other things too that were all historical artifacts, this is really the least interesting or the least telling out of the entire collection of artifacts. Which sounds weird, because you're like, it's an arrowhead, it's super cool, right? And it is super cool. And I went and learned a whole bunch about it. But I didn't get to excavate in that trench that they dug. A backhoe did that for me and dumped everything right along the side, and I went through and sifted everything out. We run it through a screen to find all the little things. And this showed up across my screen. But what was the problem with the way I was doing this is that I have no idea where that arrowhead actually was. That could have been right all the way down, 3 feet down at the bottom of the trench. That could have been sitting on the grass on top. I have no way of knowing because it has no context anymore, none whatsoever. All I know is that it was there-ish. So I don't know if this was all the way down, all by itself in its own little layer and its own little Native American site, which would be cool. It might have been up mixed in with the historical stuff, which would also be neat. There's a lot of stories of Native Americans peeking in windows and things like that from early settlers because they were curious about who are these funny-looking people with their funny-looking houses and funny-looking clothes. Could have been in there. Or, like I said, it could have been sitting on the grass. We might have been carrying a box of donated artifacts across the lawn and dropped one. I really hope it's not that, for a bunch of reasons. But it could have been. We have no way of knowing. So we found a bunch of other stuff that I thought was much more interesting. Some of these, I do admit, a couple of these were put together for a display. So this belt buckle here, that bell up there, and this little bottle top were actually from the Barnard House, and we've added them into our collection of kind of look what's been excavated at the village, and it counts because the Barnard House is here now. Technicality, but I'll take it. But we found a lot of ceramics. This right here is what's called flow blue, which is it's a particular ceramic style. If anyone's interested in ceramics, you've probably heard of it, but it has a very kind of a fuzzy look to the painting. It looks pretty much like your average, blue china, white plate, blue detail, but it has this really fuzzy kind of washed look to it, and to the blue part. And they did that because hand painted became very popular, but it's cost money and time to make it, so they basically used transfer print, which is much easier. It's basically a stamp, and then would wash over it and just kind of muddy it up just a little bit to make it kind of look like hand painted. So that's kind of an early cheat. But you got a handful of other kinds of just whiteware, creamware, porcelain. It looks like a white dinner plate. It's basically the takeaway from all those. And then this flat window glass is what this is right here. And those handful of things are all just flat, thin pieces of window glass, most likely. Some brown bottle glass. And then a whole bunch of nails. And anybody who's ever excavated in historical site will tell you you walk away with more brick, chinking, or mortar, and nails than anything else. I have right now, just from one day's sifting of some soil out of a space, not that large, something like 4 bags of nails and 2 bags of mortar and brick that I had to clean, all of them, scrub them with a toothbrush for hours and hours and hours. And it's great because it tells us that they had nails, bricks, and mortar, which is really not that surprising. But that's part of the thing, too, with archaeology, is you still need to collect all of that. You still need to record all of that. Fortunately, we usually just weigh those kinds of things, like this will break into 2 pieces so easily in a bag, and then that doesn't tell you anything if you go, we have 1, no, we have 2, oh, it's 3 now, 4, 5. So we weigh things like this. Nails, most often will get weighed. Sometimes they'll get counted. I've seen both. But they don't really look anything like nails, do they? No. Nope. They are covered in all that nasty corrosive stuff. And mostly that just tells me they're old and that they probably were not burned in a fire. Because when you burn a nail and you get it up really hot in a fire, it actually kind of changes it chemically, and there's a word for it, and it escapes me at the moment. But annealed?
Annealed?
It's like annealed. I think there's another word, though, because I remember that one. Tempered, I think, is the one I'm looking for. It tempers it, and it doesn't get nearly so rusty. It'll still get a tarnish on it, but it doesn't look like this, where it's all globby and rocks stuck to it and all those kinds of things. So that's all that tells us, although there are some other pieces that do look like they were burned in a fire, so go figure. So I think I'll open up to a little bit of questions at this point. I know I kind of went over a lot of things briefly and figured I would sort of address more specific questions. Now, I didn't even talk about dating whatsoever. Is there any questions about things like dating or anything like that?
Hey, could you tell if those nails were mass-produced or handmade or forged?
Excellent question. So what he's talking about is that over the years, things changed. We talked last month about how ceramic styles changed, and we use that for dating as well. It's like cars. Every year they make a new model, and it looks close but not quite like the old one, right? And you get a lot of things like that that you can use to kind of look at the differences and help date your site. So these nails, it's kind of hard to tell probably for you guys sitting back here, but these are what's called square nails. And square nails are actually kind of a middle stage between what used to be called forged nails, which was literally a blacksmith just banging out nails, and then the round wire nails that we have now. The nails we use now, they're round mostly, right? And then they get that little stamp on the top. And those are actually cut from a large piece of wire. Square nails are the kind of weird in-between, got used for regularly for about 50 years or so, and then they kind of phased out. And it works out nicely because it tells you this is late 1800s and into the 1900s, mostly. And those are actually from one large sheet. They have a sheet of iron that's however thick you want your nails to be, and then they just chop out the nails off of it. And that's how you make a square nail. These ones are those chopped out, which puts them to more late 1800s or mid to late 1800s.
So why don't you scrape the crud off of them so that you can...
Oh, believe me, I did scrape the crud off of these.
This is after the scraping?
This is after the scraping and the brushing, and you don't want to scrape too much. There's one other thing that I can do, because this is rusted, corroded right on there. You probably don't have too many things around your house that look like this, but when something really, really, really rusts, it starts to look like this. It doesn't just get a little tarnish on the outside, that rust just goes. I've found things before that are just one big ball of rust, and there's almost no way of knowing what's inside of that big ball of rust unless you use what's called electrolysis. And that's a mixture of, my memory says baking soda, copper wire, electricity, and water. And what that does is that actually, I'm not a chemist, I don't know. It takes the rust off is what it does. And you do periodically take it off and just give it another really good brushing and scrape that stuff off. And you can usually get down to it, what the original item looked like. But again, that's very time consuming. You can be at that for a really long time before you get down to what you're looking at. And I know their nails, you know their nails, I know they had nails. I'm not going to waste my time doing it on these. Now, had I found something neat like a belt buckle or a bell, that's probably brass or bronze or copper, so won't work with that. But something like a belt buckle or something, then I might take the time to really do a thorough cleaning and really reveal what's underneath. But mostly what you find are the odds and ends and metal bits. Because when you're excavating, it's very rare that you find no one just leaves their house and the thing gets nicely compressed and then covered in dirt, right? What we're finding is mostly their garbage. It's those Midden Piles, it's the privy, which I can vouch does actually still smell just a little bit, even after a couple hundred years. Has a very organic smell. Not terrible, just it's there. Which, by the way, it did smell in the bottom of that trench, too, so that's the other reason I think it's a barn that we had out here. But you're looking through their garbage. So it's rare that you're going to find these intact, whole pieces of anything. I know a lot of people will ask, well, all that stuff is valuable, right? Would you pay for any of that? No, it's somebody's garbage. It's a broken piece of a plate. It is, my mom used to call boy treasures. They're things that, if you're into it, yeah. If you're into it, yeah, it's interesting, but it's not, doesn't have any particular value other than the knowledge you can get from it. Again, a broken top of a bottle, yeah, it looks neat, and it's cool that we found it, and it tells us that, some of the things that they would have been using, but no one's going to pay for that. Because again, it's garbage is what it is. Any other kind of question-y things? Yeah.
We have a lot of building in Troy in the last 60 years. And over that time, did the museum manage to collect anything interesting? We had some very giant excavating going on.
We did. We actually have a number of some Native American arrowheads and things like that that have been collected from that process. A lot of times, because it's not technically, archaeology is kind of a weird legal situation because it varies between who owns the land, who digs it up, and then there's this is part of our cultural heritage, it should be in a museum. Indiana Jones, it belongs in a museum, kind of approach. So, like, you look at treasure hunters and things like that out in the, you hear about this all the time where they find some Spanish galleon, and some treasure hunter spends all this time and money and picks all this stuff up, and it's really cool, and he's excited, and he goes, look, we found this huge gold cache, and the Spanish government goes, oh, that's ours. Never makes it to a museum kind of situation. So a lot of those things really don't end up in a museum. And the other thing is that a lot of these large-scale excavations that maybe we knock out a whole bunch of historic homes and we put in a Kmart. Is there anything you think laying in your backyard that would be particularly historically valuable or interesting? Mostly not. So as sad as it is to see a lot of these kinds of old houses go and lose the archaeology that goes along with all the things that are buried under there, they're not always places worth excavating. It's not going to answer a research question for us. I mean, if I found this in somebody's backyard, I'd go, yep, well, we've got nails. We knew they had nails. That's nothing new. We got bits of ceramics. Okay, yep, that people have to eat off of plates, right? There's nothing particularly intrinsically interesting or valuable about these things unless they're helping us answer a question we had. So, to answer your question, not that much actually ends up coming here. Between the landowners keeping them, the construction crews pretending they didn't see them. Well, and that's the other thing, is that'll hold up a construction project something awful. When you bump into a brick wall or something like that, they're really supposed to stop, and they're supposed to have an archaeologist come in and evaluate it for its historical value and see whether or not this is something that needs to be preserved and excavated. Usually it's not, but it's something you have to do, or you're supposed to do. And I think more often than not, a lot of places go, kick some dirt over that, and I didn't see it. So between those three things, not that much actually has come to us. We do have a number of things from when they picked up and moved the Niles house. Fred Barnard donated a big box full of stuff that I'm still working my way through right now. Some of the items are here. So he's donated a lot of those things to us. So we are caretaking those right now. Which actually brings up the other point of caretaking. Once you've excavated, you have two things that you have to do. One of two things. You either have to take immaculately good care of these things, because now you're its keeper of this. It is your job to maintain this and take care of it, which is much like a museum. When you accept a donation from someone, let's say you came and dropped off your grandma's bookcase or whatever, and we accept that as a donation, we now are responsible for that, and we have to take care of that and maintain it and make sure it doesn't deteriorate or anything like that. Archaeology is the same way. Once you've excavated this, you're expected to either study and take care of it or return it to the site. So I know, for example, our speaker from last month, the site in Israel, there's actually a large kind of a, I don't want to say cave because there's really a hole in the ground, but it looks like a cave. And all of the ceramics that they don't want to keep, the things that are just, yep, that's a piece of broken pot, we don't care, are just dumped in that pit. It's back at the site, and it just gets dumped there. So then there's the other reason, is that a lot of times people don't want to accept a donation like this of these kind of artifacts, because then we have to take care of them. And who wants to spend all that time and money and effort taking care of that?
Alex, too, we have many artifacts that came from Troy here, but the situation is the same with many of those as with the arrowhead you talked about. Those were brought to us from someone, and all the context and the history is pretty much gone now. There may be some personal items from family, we have some family history of. But when they bring in farm implements or other kinds of commonly used things from farms of the 1800s, that's another example of something we may already have 5 or 6 of, and if someone just brought it in, we can't really date the era because they don't know, and there really isn't a story to tell, or as Alex says, there's not a new thing to be discovered or fact to be proven by it.
Exactly.
Because of the need to care for these things and store these things, there's only so many things said. If somebody offers Lorraine another sewing machine, I think they'll scream. We just get those all the time, and think about it, the Singer sewing machine in the 1920s and 1930s, that was a prized possession. It was expensive, it was used a lot in families. They were kind of neat looking, so people kept them down through generations. And now we're so proud to want to give you a great-grandson machine, but you've got, you know, one out in this house and one out in that house and 5 more in storage, and what are you gonna do with another one? And they don't have any allow except it's all a sewing machine. So that's the kind of thing you run into as a museum.
Yeah, if it's Solomon Caswell's shovel, fine, we'll take it. If it's great-grandma somebody's and not quite remember where it came from, we got it at an antique show. You know, less interested. The same goes for sickles. If we get another sickle, I'll scream. Any other questions?
When the arrowhead you found, you said you wrote a lot about it.
Oh, man, I kind of did glaze over that. So this arrowhead is from what's called the Mississippian culture, this style, although it bears resemblance to a few others. And as you go from place to place, you'll find that there's different styles of tools that they'll use, and arrowheads actually become very specific, and they're very specialized between the culture and their needs. So you might have really big ones for shooting a mammoth, but you don't want to use something this big if you're shooting a partridge, right? So they're going to be specialized to their purposes, and then they have a little just personal style that's evolved over the culture's history. So this one is most closely matches what's called Mississippian. And Mississippian was a culture that actually they were mound builders down through, appropriately, most of the way up the Mississippi, around over the sides. They actually came even a little bit further toward the East Coast and got just up into Michigan, more this chunk than anywhere else. And there are those mounds in Ohio, and that would have been from this culture. And that doesn't mean, oh, it's the Mississippian tribe. It's sort of, this is the American culture, and then every state's got its own thing that it does, right? But we have a lot of things in common. There's, McDonald's everywhere you go, and that kind of thing. Same idea where this cultural style, they've kept that. This is made out of what's called Bayport chert, most likely. I've also heard Onondaga, which comes more from the Niagara region, kind of upstate New York. I'm leaning personally from the people I've talked to that it's more likely Bayport, which comes from the Bayport area of Michigan mostly. So there's a stone called chert, C-H-E-R-T, and chert is part of a family of stones that's called cryptocrystalline. You can't make a stone tool out of just anything because of the properties that they have. You try to make something like a sandstone, it's too crumbly, it'll fall apart, it won't flake. And when you're making a stone tool, it's kind of hard to see on this. You see this little chunk right here where it's like kind of concave? And those are really all along the sides here. When you're making a stone tool, you actually are striking at it with either an antler or another stone, and you're removing these kind of, you think like a clamshell kind of pieces from the stone. And then you're basically just knocking away everything that isn't arrowhead when you're doing that. And it's actually a really interesting process. There's lots of YouTube videos. I recommend looking into it. It's kind of hard to describe up here without anything to show you, but it's really an interesting process. So the properties that chert has makes it unique from things that are like just granites or quartz or things like that. You can use quartz. It doesn't work particularly well. Real quick question?
When the arrowhead was attached to a reed or something for an instrument?
Its shaft for here.
How did they get it to stick together? You have one arrowhead, you have one reed, and one rod. What made them stick together?
Pardon? Yeah, twine. She said twine. And that's basically it. What you would have here is the shaft of the arrow would come down here. It would most likely have a little groove cut into it so that it opened up and would fit on either side here. And then you would have had most likely wrapped around it twine. I've also seen a lot of, it's amazing what you can do with string, right? I've also seen a lot of resins and things used, so like saps and things like that could be used just to help keep it stuck, and they're still going to be wrapped, but it helps keep it stuck. The other stone you frequently see used is called flint, just like the city, although I don't think there's really any flint in Flint, so I'm not sure where they came up with that. There's not much in Michigan at all. I don't know. I didn't name it. And flint works a little better than chert even, but chert is mostly what's available in this area. There's also obsidian is very popular, and of course you have to go somewhere where there's a volcano to get obsidian. But yeah, the people would walk hundreds of miles to collect their flint or their chert or whatever stone that they're going to use because it's so valuable, and these things get traded all over. So you'll find evidence of, none that I know of in Michigan, but even if you go all the way up to the Dakotas, you'll find evidence of obsidian that is chemically the same as the obsidian you'll find down in Mexico, which means that stuff was traded all the way up. You know, you think that, wow, you know, we're so global, we're trading with everybody. This is not new. People have been trading things, you know, across continents for thousands of years before us. It's really actually quite impressive when you consider not having the, you know, motor vehicles or anything like that. They're just, well, let's go to, you know, let's go to Dakota. And, you know, they just heft the things and then it gets traded all the way across for valuables.
Does design give you a period of time that may have been produced in?
Mississippian culture was predominantly about 1100 AD up until historical contact, so mid 1800s, early 1800s is mostly when that period occurred. After that, culture started to mesh, and we stopped calling it Mississippian. So yeah, this could be anything from about 200 some years old to 900 years old.
So where is, besides on the slide, that tray of artifacts, or is it a tray?
It is a tray. It's a big tray that actually was meant to be displaying pennants and things like that, but we're using it as a display case. Right now it is actually upstairs in Caswell. I had it moved up there because we had a few little, young groups coming through the Caswell house, and I didn't want anyone knocking over my tray full of artifacts that are valuable to me and no one else. But I will be bringing it back down in the near future again for if anybody would like to see it.
And can we also revisit what John brought up about the archives and the things that are stored at the village? Because his point about, and your point about, if I see get one more scythe or sickle donated, or sewing machine or whatever, people donate things to the museum. Do you take it on consideration whether or not that's something that really fits into the history job, which is what the Historical Society is? It has a job of telling us about the history of this area. So how do you decide what you are keeping and what has value?
We look for things that have what's called provenance or provenience, depending on who you talk to. But it's basically an item that has its history with it. So if it's, things that somebody found at a flea market and thought, boy, isn't this cool? I thought you guys would love to have it. We've perfected the art of saying no lately. Because if we just keep taking all of these things, we cannot adequately care for them and store them, and then everything suffers. So we want things that have a story to tell about Troy. So like I said, if, we don't need another sickle, or we don't need another sewing machine. If it happens to be Solomon Caswell's sickle, or some other famous Troy families or something like that, something of theirs, and you say this belonged to great grandma so and so, and she had it in the family for a long time, and then it went over to aunt so and so when grandma died, and now that has a story, and it has that provenience, and it has something interesting and relevant about it. And that is usually how we decide what to take. And some of it, too, is that we can only take so much. And we have to be a little bit selective just on the idea that, it's a very nice sewing machine. And you know what? You even do have it. It says it comes from Grandma so-and-so, and that's great to know. But we've got 3 sewing machines like it right now downstairs. Do we need another sewing machine to help us tell the story of Troy? Not really. And that's kind of usually how we decide, is looking at it, is this going to help us tell the story? It's something unique? Maybe, maybe not.
Joanne, Alex is talking about primarily are things that we would actually add to our collection through an accessioning process. And that's a formal process where we accept it from a donor, and that's cataloged and cared for. The Troy Museum, when the city was running it, and to a lesser extent, the Historical Society running it, has accepted things to the collection. There were just thousands of items, many thousands Troy had archival services off and on, sometimes it was better, sometimes it wasn't so good. We accepted, or the museum years ago, accepted far more things than they could properly accession. So things were accessioned. There were multiple record-keeping systems used over the years. So the collection records aren't in the shape you would like them to be. But it's a significant expense to pay trained archivists to do that work. We do have 3 archivists working for us now on a very part-time basis, and they're working through and doing those kinds of things on a priority basis. The other thing is when we accept things from the public, there are really 2 categories of things we do accept. One are things to accession and add to our archives. The other are things that we don't need for the archives for one reason or another, but could be used in our teaching programs and our school programs. So those are things that we understand are going to get worn over time, probably broken over time, but they're very useful teaching tools for the students and some of the adults that come here. When we do that, we make it very clear to the donor what we intend to do with it. So we will say, this isn't something that we would accept for our archives, but we think this would be very useful for our teaching program. So if that would be okay for you, with you, to use that for teaching purposes, for illustration purposes, so that people can get a real hands-on experience, understanding it's going to wear out over time and ultimately be replaced, we'd like very much to have it for that purpose, and then somebody who's a donor can decide, yes, they want to do that or no, they don't.
I've never figured out why some of the arrowheads have that little tree trunk sticking down and some are like that without it.
Oh, you're referring to ones that look kind of like this here,
Yes.
right? So, and that is one of those little style differences that I was talking about, how different places do things a little bit differently. You know, Greek vases look like this, and Mesopotamian vases look like this. Everyone has their own particular style for doing things. So this one, what you've got here is, again, you'd have that shaft that would come off, and this provides a little space to help lock the arrow in when you wrap it. So that would be, so you'd have your shaft here, and then the wrappings would run through those notches. Part of the reason you don't see as many that look quite like this is that's very difficult to do properly. This, looking at this tells me that this is sort of a later or more recent arrowhead style, because if you're making something that you want to, you know, use for hunting or something like that, they're going to break. It's stone. They're pretty thin when people really get good at it, and it is something that evolves over time, and as you know, different cultures have gotten better and better and better and better at making these. But that little notch there, all that's held on by is the strength of stone on that little space. So it's time-consuming to make, and they're less sturdy. It's pretty rare to actually pull one out of the ground that looks just like that. Usually one of those sides is broken, at least one. And then, but like I said, it's just a style difference. You say potato, I say potato, but making stone tools instead. Yep, follow up. Yeah, follow up. It looked like your hand was up again. Yeah.
I've seen mapping done, and I'm surprised that people have 10 fingers.
Yeah. I'm frequently rather shocked myself.
Now, I have been to rock shows where they'll sell obsidian
Mm-hmm.
now made, currently made.
Yeah.
And they sell them for 79 cents a piece. How do they make those?
More or less the same way. Well, the credible ones do, I should say. There are, I'm sure, much easier, cheap ways to do it. Part of what makes this process so difficult and so time-consuming to do in the historical fashion is that the tools you're using. A traditional Native American hunter who's sitting there making his arrowhead is going to use a hammerstone like I showed you, which is, you know, they're usually about yay big or so depending on what stage of the process you're in. And then they're going to use that to knock off large chunks. And then as they work their way down to the smaller and smaller, you know, arrowhead, because you're starting usually with a piece that's something like this. That's what we call a core. And that's their starting piece. It's usually a large chunk of flint or obsidian or chert or whatever it is you're using, and they start knocking these pieces off. And that's why she says people look like they're going to lose their fingers, because you're smashing rocks together is really what you're doing. And as you work your way down, you start using things like antler, and it's called percussion flaking, or not percussion flaking, I'm sorry, pressure flaking. So you move from percussion, which is whacking, to pressure flaking, which is just applying hard, steady pressure to the edge of the blade, and then that causes the stone to fracture underneath and break off. So it can be time-consuming in that way, but people who do it in the modern fashion, who are making them to sell, mostly what I've seen used is it's a tool that's about this long. This is for more the finishing process anyway. It's a tool that's about this long. It's a wooden handle with a heavy-duty piece of like copper wire type of thing fixed into it, and that's what they use to do all the minuscule work along here. So a modern tool could do this quite easily. But if you're trying to do that with a piece of antler, you'll be at that for a much longer time. So that most likely was, this looks like a more modern one to me, was made with, it's just a piece of metal tool, like a pick of some sort. And I've seen guys go very quickly with those. That's something you can sit around the campfire just hanging out one evening and knock out a handful of them relatively easily, if you're good. I'm not, but if you're good, you can do it. It's a surprising skill, because what you're doing is you've got your rock, and you knock off, and we'll say it's kind of a nice flat on one side, and then you start striking so that pieces are coming off from the underside. And you're really just knocking away piece after piece after piece, and if you're not careful, and if you don't read your flint or your chert or your obsidian very well, and look for imperfections as you're going, the whole thing can fall apart on you. Our arrowhead, yeah, little inclusions and things in the stone. And again, it's hard to tell on this, but right up here, this portion, you can see where it kind of changes direction almost a little bit, where if you follow this line, it would come more this way. This is actually what's been called retouched, which means either somewhere along the way in the process it broke while they were trying to make it, or it just broke a little bit through use. You know, shot a deer, hit the tree, whatever. A little piece comes off, and they'll retouch them. So it actually has a little bit different right along here. Looks a little different than the rest of it along through here. So you can fuss with them a little bit and that kind of thing. But it's fragile, they break. You have to make new ones.
So how much time did you actually spend going through the stuff from the trench in order to find that one tray of collectibles?
We were very fortunate. The gentleman who was kind of the supervisor for the construction work here was something of an interested party himself. He thought that archaeology was really neat, and I hear all the time, oh, I wanted to be an archaeologist when I was a kid. And I just never stopped listening to that little voice. But he was one of those kind of guys. And so they came and got me, and I was able to hop down into that trench for a little while. I got maybe half an hour to take some pictures, to kind of poke around and get my impressions of what was going on before he was like, we do kind of have to, you know, on the clock here. So they refilled it with gravel and all that stuff. And I says, I'd love to be able to sift at least through this dirt. My context is gone, but I'd like to know what's in there. Excuse me. And he says, yeah, no, that's no problem at all. We'll just fill it with the dirt from over there. So he was actually very nice and let us save a large section of the excavated soil. And then I ran that through a sifter. And a sifter, it's a screen. Typically you use like 1/4-inch mesh screen. And it's just strung in a wood frame, and it's usually hanging from a tripod, and you just shake all the dirt through, and everything that's bigger than 1/4 inch stays behind, and all the dirt goes through. And that was where I found all of these kinds of things, and I only had about one day that I could actually make it work between my schedule and them wanting to, you know, kind of get on with things. I spent Labor Day, Memorial Day, whatever it is that's in September, about 6 hours going. I can never keep them straight, don't criticize. Spent about 6 hours sifting soil, and that's how I found everything that we have so far, which is a total of about 8 to 10 quart Ziploc bags right now. But again, normally in excavation, you'd be at this much longer. It's just because, again, it was under construction. The site itself is still here. They just put one, 2.5, 3 foot trench right through it. So it wasn't like they were going to build a whole building out there and destroy the entire thing, which is frequently the case. The site is still there. It's still mostly preserved. So their thought was, we'd like to get on with this if that's okay with you. And unfortunately, we did have to kind of get on with things because we were on our own time clock with weddings and things booked for following months. So I didn't get very much time, but normally you could be at this site for season after season after season, months and months and months. And not even a very large space. I worked at a site in Waterford that we were primarily excavating 2 spaces of it, just 2 squares, and they were, I think, 3 by 3 feet. And one of them got about 3.5, 4 feet deep, and that took us 2 to 3 seasons to get to that point. And not that we were excavating every day, but it did take many, many, many hours to get even that far down. Using the techniques and the style that we were doing, which was more careful excavation with the trowel. And I'll sit back so you guys can see what I'm talking about. Because when I say trowel, most people think gardening trowel, but that's actually not quite what the tool looks like. It's what's called a masonry trowel. It's in here somewhere. There we go. This tool right here. So it's what's called a masonry trowel, and it's just a flat blade triangle like this, flat stamped steel. And you literally shave and scrape off layers of dirt at a time. And you don't ever dig. We say dig because that's kind of a nice colloquial term for it, but you are very carefully excavating as you go down. You're not shoveling like this, and that's one of the things you have to break newbies at, is that they want to just dig a hole. But you want to take this whole thing down nice and flat. You can see they're excavating individual spaces differently, but each space is totally flat. And ideally pretty clean. This space is good. This guy is working kind of dirty. I'd be getting on his case if this was my site. But you want to keep that space as clear as possible so that you can see all those changes in soil color. Because there's lots of places where there's almost nothing left. If you're looking into most Native American sites and things like that, you think, what kinds of things do Native Americans have and use? They're things that are made out of wood, made out of leather, made out of bone, and things made out of stone. Most of those things don't hold up. A few hundred years in the soil, and they're gone. Gone, gone, gone. Nothing left whatsoever, except a dark spot. So if I were excavating and I found a little dark spot right here, maybe for example, I would excavate that space differently. I'd usually grab a spoon and start just hollowing that out and seeing what that space looks like. And you get the shape of what that is. It might turn out to be a little basin, it might turn out to be a post hole, and that might be all that tells us that there was a post of some sort there. And if you find there's a dark spot here, and a dark spot here, and a dark spot here, and a dark spot all the way around, maybe in a circle, or maybe you've got some sort of a structure there, something like that. Everyone's heard of Stonehenge. Have you heard of Woodhenge? You think I'm joking. There's a Woodhenge. It's a few miles from Stonehenge. Just kind of follow the river up. And all that's left of it is a whole big circle of dark spots. All that remains, which is why no one really noticed it. It's much more of a recent kind of discovery, and it's, of course, not that exciting to go and see because it's a bunch of dark spots. I think they have little cement pillars now that stand about this tall or something marking them out, but it's just dark spots. So you want to work totally clean, keep it as flat as possible. And I always say the way you want to think about it is imagine you ever, you hold like goggles or something up over the water and you can see down, right? Imagine pushing a sheet of glass through the dirt so you can see down as you go. That is kind of how you want to excavate, just layer, 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 just real fine as you go down. And that's kind of the image that it's, I think works pretty well anyway. So these guys might have been at this at a guess because they're just looking at what they've got. This right here is probably, if they're working every day, that could be 4 to 5 weeks worth of excavating in this style. Now, if this was Israel, like our last speaker, you're using pickaxes, you're using what's called turias, which are like a hoe and a shovel had a baby. It looks like just a shovel that's kind of bent at the end and flat. And you're just dragging up dirt with those kinds of things. You are going down quickly because they're less concerned with spots in the soil and things like that because they're just not there because it's a desert, more of a desert region. And they're concerned with the structure, what the place looks like. So they're looking for the building, they're looking for the big stone, you know, if there's a basin and things like that, some of you may recall. Those are the kinds of things that they're finding at that site, and so that's what they can do. So they could excavate in that style. This could go very quickly. The other thing is that sometimes you do, let's skip ahead again. There's a better way to do this. I'm not going to do it, but there we go. So let's say we're excavating this site here, and we've gone through all of this the long, hard way, and we get down to the bottom and go, okay, that's sterile sand down there. There's nothing there. So we know what everything looks like through time now, what this whole site looks like through the years, all layered up. Because remember, this is, you know, when you look at just when you're digging, that's your day calendar, this is your month calendar, right? So we'll say that maybe we know that what we're looking for is right here. That little space, everything above it is garbage, and everything below it, whatever. This right here is our sweet spot. We can measure down from the surface, find out about what height that level is, and we'll actually use a backhoe or just shovels and just strip away very quickly to get down to the part that we're interested in. Because otherwise, this is a very time-consuming and very expensive process if you want to sit there and very carefully scrape away with your trowel down through all of this that you know is full of nothing whatsoever. Like when we excavated the Niles Barnard house, we did that. We know that the top 8 inches, 10 inches, whatever it was pretty much garbage and just dirt, modern, not of interest to us as archaeologists. Our question was down here. We actually had a backhoe, and we dug a trench, and we stripped off the top 10 inches or whatever it was, and that sped things along very quickly, and we could actually get a better idea of how things looked in the next trench over. So time scale varies, though. This is kind of your takeaway from that. To answer your question, it'll vary depending on how you're doing it. Fort Michilimackinac, their trowels, I'm not kidding, are like this big. They're little itty bitty trowels. Mine's a 6-inch that I normally use, so about 6 inches. I see a lot of people use 8-inch trowels, which just dig faster because they're bigger. But those guys are they're going down inches a season. They're really, because they're looking for really, really tiny things, trade beads and stuff like that. So it varies considerably where you're excavating and what you're looking for. Any other questions?
Are you that totally patient about everything in your life?
No. And you know what?
And when you have to do that, you just have to be an extremely patient person. My goodness.
It's kind of like fishing. You're sitting there going, well, there you go. Then maybe archaeology is not for you. You're sitting there going, bored. Ooh, what's that? And then you're interested again. And then you're going, bored. You're living from peak to peak, as it were. And when you get to the point where you're finding something really neat, like, I'm not going to zoom all the way back, but the big photo there with everybody excavating, they had all those big, they're broken pots is what those spaces they were really carefully going over were. That's so cool to find, because you're like, look, it's the whole pot just went and broke right there. It wasn't thrown away. Something happened right there, and there was a bunch of them, which means that site was probably destroyed in some sort of a conflict. Everything just collapsed and broke all at once. So that's really interesting when you're actually excavating. That's the catching a fish part. Like, this is cool, and you're enjoying it. And then when you're excavating through all of this boring stuff here where it's just sterile sand, like I know all of this right down here is sterile sand. There's nothing whatsoever in that. It's really, really dull. And it's usually hot, and you're usually getting kind of cranky, and you're waiting for your drink break, and you're waiting for lunch, and it's, you get to talk to people around you, which is usually a little better, but it can get kind of boring. As much fun as it is, it does get boring.
It tells other stories, doesn't it? We did some rock counting in Flint Ridge, Ohio.
Yeah.
And that was found, that type of flint was found.
All over the place.
Used by the Fremont Indians in Arizona.
Yep.
So they have their trade routes and stuff. But the fact that they have their trade routes and they have pictographs and petroglyphs, which meant they had time to
Well,
That's a whole other story of.
yeah, so what you're talking about is what's called specialization. And if you guys get me going on this too much, I will never shut up. But, because this is like one of my favorite areas is the early kind of dawn of civilization as we know it. So your first people are hunter-gatherers, and the image anyway is living meal to meal, and that it's a very harsh existence, although actually it turns out they work a lot less than we do for subsistence. It's like 14-hour weeks or something for their survival, and of course we're sitting there going, 40 is just not enough hours, because you're looking at your watch to say 40 hours. But as people began to settle down and develop agriculture, you could have only a handful of people could go out and work the fields and provide enough food for the entire community. People began to settle in one place because you had to stay with your farm. Farms don't move, right? You don't have to follow the farm herds anywhere. They stay put. So as domestication and farming begins to take off and people are staying in one place and they can collect enough food, a handful of people, to care for everybody in the community, that frees up other people to do other things. And that begins what's called specialization. So you're farmers, and I need you to make me some stone tools, and can you go out and do some hunting because we still need some meat, and can you learn how to do writing and things like that? The community can break up and do other things. And that's really how all these specialized crafts begin. So things like getting better at stone tools, making pots and ceramics and things like that. There was no need for that before because you weren't storing anything that long. It's really hard to carry a big, heavy clay pot full of meat or water or whatever it is when you're walking 30 miles to your next place of habitation. There was almost no pottery whatsoever before people started to settle down. So yeah, that's called specialization, and it's very an interesting field. Any other thoughts, questions, comments, concerns, things to throw at me for talking too long? All right, well, thank you guys all so much for coming.